Center for Border Studies at JSI. I'd like to welcome Dr. Birte Vogel, pronounced correctly, and Professor Jessica Field as well, who's from JSI. So today we'll be having a kind of guest lecture and an interactive session on a very interesting topic on using borderlands for peace building with a case study of the United Nations buffer zone in Cyprus. And I'm really glad that, really thank you Jessica and thank you Birte, because coming all the way from Manchester and speaking to our students, we are indeed honored to have you here, and the cutting edge work that is being done at CII and the University of Manchester in peace building, humanitarian response, post-conflict recovery and so on and so forth, as well as the kind of applied work that is also being done by HCRI is very, very inspiring. So, and I really hope that the students will now look at HCRI and the research being done there as we move along in the course. I'd also welcome you to speak to these students who are specifically with the Certificate in Border Studies program that our center has just recently initiated. And they basically are students who give up their Saturdays, Sundays and holidays to sit through the coursework, and the course officially ends in February once they complete their internships. So with that being said, a brief kind of introduction. Dr. Birte Vogel, she's a lecturer in Peace and Conflict Studies at HCRI, University of Manchester, and an assistant editor and the assistant editor of the journal Peace Building, which is published by Taylor and Francis, as well as a co-investigator on the AHRC funded project, The Art of Peace, Interrogating Community-Devised Arts-Based Peace Building. Her academic interest is mainly on the interface between international and local approaches to peace. And in addition to the arts, Dr. Birte mainly works on projects looking at the intersection of everyday economics and peace. Her recent co-edited book, Economies of Peace, Economy Formation Processes in Conflict-Affected Societies, was published with Routledge recently in 2019. She was also previously involved in the EU FP7 funded project, Cultures of Governance and Conflict Resolution in India and Europe. Dr. Birte Vogel is also the director of teaching at HCRI and holds a PhD in humanitarianism and conflict response from Manchester, and is an MLit in Peace and Conflict Studies from the University of St Andrews, Scotland, as well as a bachelor's degree in economics and political science from the University of Munster. And I'd also like to welcome Jessica, who has done extensive work on conflict studies, especially on refugees, and we're also very interested in knowing about and the connections, drawing a comparative between what Birte will discuss and what you were explaining on the Ladakh, the work in Ladakh and the northern kind of borderlands in India in a way. And with that, I'll keep the session open, and thank you once again for being here, Birte, and Jessica, really, for facilitating and organizing, helping us organize this. That's it, yeah, and I'll stop.
Okay. Yeah, good morning everyone, and thank you very much for the kind introduction and also for having me here today, which I think is really interesting. So what I'm going to do today is talk a bit about the borderlands in Cyprus from my previous research, but then also Jessica and I will talk a bit more about the project that we're currently having going on in Ladakh. And as you are all experts in borderland studies, we hope to learn a bit from you as well. Because it's possibly fair to say that I'm not a borderland scholar by definition. I'm a peace and conflict studies scholar, but that places a lot of my work in the margins of societies, or at the conflict, or at the borders of conflicts and of societies and contested conflicts. So while the idea of looking at spaces and borders and these kind of angles are more conceptually new for me, because I'm coming from this peace and conflict studies perspective, I think they're very central to what I'm doing as well, so I'm very interested in hearing your thoughts on all of this. I have a little PowerPoint, which mainly has a couple of pictures in it, but so don't know it's a bit of a mix which side you have to look at. So what I want to talk today about in the talk, which will be just like 20 or 30 minutes long, is a bit like who governs the borderlands in Cyprus actually. So quite often when we think about the borderlands, we're thinking about them as remote and maybe like power vacuums or so on. So who governs the borderlands in Cyprus? And I will give you also a very short introduction to the idea of civil society peace building, because this is what the project actually was about. It looked at the role of civil society and how civil society kind of interacted with this space, but also with the peace process in Cyprus more generally. And I hope that you, from that talk, get a little bit of an understanding of the Cypriot case study as well. In our discussion that we then take to the Ladakh case study, we will talk a bit about more, but what in general governs borderlands. So I will give you the civil society example from Cyprus, but what other things govern borderlands, what other things shape borderlands, what other things make power up in borderlands. So even though we think they're at the margin, they might be quite central to some actors. So how's that playing out? The study that I'm presenting you today had a key question of how does the space is shaped and how does the space shape the possibilities of civil society and activism actually. I did this study in Cyprus between 2011 and 2014 roughly. Most of that was for my PhD at the time, but also for the project that you mentioned that looked at different approaches of conflict resolution in India and Europe. So we had 3 European case studies: Cyprus, Bosnia Herzegovina, and it's a while ago. What was the third one? Can't remember what the third one in Europe was, and then we had 3 in India, which was Kashmir, Bihar, and just Northeast India in general. So I was part of, like, in charge of the Cyprus case study for that, and I for that conducted around 100 interviews with INGOs, so the European Union, different United Nations organizations and so on, politicians, but also normal citizens and so on, so how they perceived that kind of peace building in the buffer zone. And I also just observed quite a lot, so I was just for months basically hanging out in the buffer zone and looked what people were doing and tried to find out why they were doing this and how they used that kind of space. Has anyone been to Cyprus? Does anyone, without looking at the map, know where Cyprus is? Cyprus is a very, very tiny island in the Mediterranean, basically. So it's located just at the coastline of Syria and Turkey. And I will give you a very short introduction to the conflict, because it's possibly not so well known, because the whole of Cyprus has about 1 million people living there. It's possibly a very small village for most people here. So it's a small conflict, but as most borderland conflicts, like borderlands kind of bring out the dynamics of conflicts more, so you get them more pronounced, and this is why that's kind of small, tiny space can actually tell you a lot about general dynamics that you might find in other border zones as well. But yeah, so the Cypriot conflict has been termed as one of those intractable conflicts, along with the Kashmir conflict, for example, as well. It's been going on for a very long time, so it has a lot of layers of what that conflict is, and that already brings some parts of a lot of the problems of the conflict is like to find out what the roots of this conflict are actually. So Cyprus has a long history of colonialization as well. Because it was such a small island, it has been colonized by the Egyptians, by the Venetians, by the Romans, and so on. It was like always a gateway between East and West, so trade routes always went through Cyprus. So having Cyprus was always having the door, or like a stopping point between the East and the West, so it was a popular place to get. So Cyprus was never quite understood in its own right, and then became an Ottoman Empire, part of the Ottoman Empire for quite a long time. And what was interesting about this is that while it was a Greek-speaking and kind of more Hellenic traditional island, that brought a considerable Turkish-speaking and Turkish Cypriot population to the island. Then again, Cyprus was given away as a bargaining chip in the next war. It was transferred over from the Ottoman Empire to the United Kingdom, basically, as kind of a motivation to support some other military operations somewhere else by the United Kingdom, and then was under British rule. But there were three things in the history at this point that kind of led to Cypriot independence. One was that the EOKA formed, which was like a basically underground insurgents fighting for independence, or actually for unification of Cyprus with Greece, because one thing that Cypriots thought was the best thing to stop being colonized all the time is joining a bigger nation, and for, well, a good half the population, Greece was the kind of natural kind of ally to join. Also at the same time, the 1960s was a big time for decolonization globally, and also, I mean, you didn't want to create too much trouble in the NATO, basically, between Greece and Turkey. So one of the ideas was then just to keep Cyprus independent. But this independence never worked out quite well, because both sides felt they got a bad deal in it. And in the 1960s, like just 1963, 3 years later, the government collapsed actually, and the island started to kind of suffer more of intercommunal violence, basically. So all of that built up until the 1974. There was a very short war. We had, again, a lot of global dynamics. Cyprus is always embedded in a lot of global dynamics, basically. And we had the junta in Greece trying to take over control of Cyprus, Turkey intervening, and this is where, like, history obviously goes in two very different kind of directions. The Greek Cypriots said they started occupying the island, or half of the island, while the Turkish Cypriots say they came to kind of rescue them from occupation from the Greek side. But ever since, Cyprus is basically divided in a Greek Cypriot south and a Turkish Cypriot north, which you can basically see in this picture. So officially, the entire island is called the Republic of Cyprus, and it should be the independent Cyprus. But when the war happened, basically, you can see the blue dividing line which split the island. All Turkish Cypriots moved to the north of the island, and all Greek Cypriots moved to the south of the island. The ethnic groups are quite disproportionately allocated, so we have 20% Turkish Cypriots and 80% roughly Greek Cypriots. So there is a quite imbalance between these two groups. And Cyprus still has sovereign UK base areas that are still under UK control and national territory of the United Kingdom. So you have more or less 4 territories: the Turkish Cypriot side, the Greek Cypriot side, then the United Nations controlled buffer zone, which is the blue line on your picture. It's called the green line, so someone really chose the wrong color here. Yeah, so this is the kind of the territorial setup that we're looking at. And in particular, so I'm talking now about the buffer zone, but I'm not talking about this entire buffer zone dividing the island. What I will talk about is a very, very small part of that buffer zone. So you can see Nicosia, which is more or less in the middle of the island. It's a divided capital, so the buffer zone goes right across that city. And in a very, very small part of that buffer zone, which is around 150 meter long, is where all the bicommunal activities are starting. So by bicommunalism, I mean is we're having Turkish and Greek Cypriots meeting and working together for kind of political change. So in the sense, that's a very interesting development for the island, that the buffer zone is used in kind of that way. Because so what are typical assumptions that you hold or that people are holding about borderlands and buffer zones? What kind of things do we usually associate with them? If you think about borders. Yeah, exactly. Like securitized, militarized, closed, inaccessible, often remote, or neutral, or That's a couple of the keywords that, if you go through the literature, that comes up: neutral, ungoverned, remote, inaccessible. So we're quite often thinking about these areas as not part of the everyday or the daily lives of people. Which is then interesting, is that exactly that space had been used for Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots to start building peace. It doesn't... there we go. So this is a picture from within the buffer zone. It's called the Home for Cooperation. And it has become kind of the center of that little small part of the buffer zone that I just talked about. And it's interesting to see why people started to go there. So one of the problems was that after 1947, after the war, the border was closed, and it was a hard border. There was no kind of exchange between the two sides. You couldn't cross over until actually 2009, I think, was when the first border point opened again. What that means that you also kept communities apart, that people couldn't speak to each other. Quite often, intermarriage was quite common in Cyprus. So the divide kind of hit families as well. And people who worked quite closely together. So a lot of them had memories of growing up in mixed villages and kind of knowing the other sides relatively well. So we have a group of academics since the 1990s, late 1980s, who wanted to know the story of the other side, who were really interested in how the other side sees the conflict and learn more about that. And they didn't know where to meet. So they started to meet in Turkey or in Greece. They were called the Oxford Group for a while because the UK gave them some funding to fly them out to Great Britain, or they met at Harvard in the US. So it became a bit of a way of bringing people together, but there was no space for that on the island. So, but instead of bringing people across the world, I thought, like, there must be something where we can see each other. I mean, the island is so small that within like 4 hours you can really drive from one side to the other, like from one end to the other. So where can they meet? And it's quite often in these kind of small places in unregulated spaces. Someone knew someone from the United Nations who said, well, actually, we have a room in the buffer zone, and if we can get your leaders to agree to come into the buffer zone, you can meet there. So everything started in an old hotel, which is now kind of the military base for the United Nations peacekeeping forces, to meet there and start and talk. So keeping communication open and learning a bit more from each other. And building some sort of a common vision of the future, but also a common understanding of the past, or at least listening to what the past for the other side would be. That brings me a step back, where I want to talk for a few minutes just about like the idea of civil society and peace building, and what the role of civil society and peace building is, because I think that's maybe not so much of part of your course. So quite often in the idea of peace and conflict studies, we are putting a lot of emphasis on non-state actors and what we can learn about conflict and conflict dynamics by them. So civil society is quite often seen as this mediator between the state, the international community, and society. So someone who knows and speaks the language of all these other elements of society. They're connected enough to society, so to the grassroots, to know what the common feeling is. They're connected enough to the state to communicate that, but also to understand why the state has kind of certain restrictions to act in certain ways. And they're quite often understanding the values and the ideas of the international community. So over the decades of like failed peace building and interventions from the United Nations, and the criticism that they are too top-down and too removed from what the people want in society or in conflicts, civil society was in the 1990s discovered as like this thing that finally someone can tell the international community and the states, this is how you build peace, this is what we want, this is what everyone can agree on. So the great idea of the 1990s was to include civil society as a key element of building peace. And obviously with that, we got quite a bit of funding and a huge support for it. A lot of that goes back to kind of ideas of enlightenment, Kant and so on, Hegel, all of them wrote about civil society and civility. So one of the things that we have to keep in mind is a very like Eurocentric kind of idea of understanding of civil society and like how the state and society works. I mean, in a lot of societies, civil society and the state are much more connected. Governments run NGOs and so on. So it's very like an ideal type that comes from the kind of Enlightenment thinkers. So the problem was that quite soon everyone noticed that civil society wasn't that great, as theory kind of suggested. Because we have quite a lot of national civil society, nationalistic, ethno-nationalistic, so a lot of civil society that actually drives exclusive behavior rather than inclusive behavior. And that was a bit of a problem because all these big donors, the World Bank, the United Nations, the European Union, they had this massive civil society programs now, so there were a bit of a problem with who can they finance, and the ideas of terrorism came up more, so like there were a lot of conflicting ideas of how to work with civil society. So one of the authors who talked about this a lot was Michael Mann, who said like civil society can be evil. So he talked about the Nazis who had really, really dense civil society networks, for example. He talked about the Ku Klux Klan in the United States, who also it's run as a really tight civil society organization. So civil society does not necessarily work for peace, and that was one of the big things to keep in mind, basically, in the whole civil society and peace-building kind of debate. So with that in mind, there were a couple of questions, basically. How do we make sure that working with civil society is actually positive and works towards peace? And that kind of posed a couple of like particular challenges to borderland spaces and to, yeah?
I had a question.
Yeah?
Do you want me to keep asking?
No, yeah, no, ask a question. Yes, come.
So you were just saying that civil societies became more exclusive than inclusive, and they had these tendencies of supporting one faction or the other. But ultimately, isn't the civil society as a whole facing the most conflict as well? So shouldn't it be their prerogative to solve it?
Yeah, so I'm just saying it can work both ways. So the idea, the theoretical idea when we started to include civil society was it would always work for positive change. And then quite soon people realized civil society can go both ways. So it will always be exclusive. And actually the point that you're making about like being too selective with civil society and the broadening of civil society is keep that in mind, because I come back to that a bit later, because it's one of the big points I will make later, because one of the problems was that we're now getting very narrow in selecting that who is civil society, and that obviously excludes a big part of society who should be representative. If you're thinking of civil society as being representative of everyone, then obviously the exclusive part is part of that as well, technically. So I already talked a bit about this, the bicommunal activities that then started to happen in Cyprus as the idea of supporting change in Cyprus. One of the ideas was then, as the Cyprus conflict was such a long and protracted conflict, there was no movement anymore. So when in the 1990s there was an international kind of support for civil society, that was done in Cyprus as well. So Cyprus received a lot of funding for this. We had the academics going abroad. We started to use the buffer zone in the way that I just described a couple of minutes earlier. But what does that mean in terms of who governs the margins and who can use that space? So in the beginning, it was a very open space that civil society really could use in their own ideas. But it was a group of 10, 15 people, and they were possibly not disturbing anyone too much. It was such a small group that no one noticed them. And then they became more vocal, and instantly newspapers on both sides put a lot of pressure on them, like branded them as traitors to the nation because they talked to the enemy and so on. So they faced a lot of repression, and the buffer zone became also a bit their safe space. So the borderlands, the uncontrolled borderlands, became a space where they could meet without being attacked. Today, the borderlands, so making the jump to the time where I did the study now, in 2011, the borderlands are open. You can walk in from both sides. You have to show your passport because you can't cross over, so you have to show your passport, go in and out, but you don't really get a stamp or anything. You just have to show identification. Mainly to make sure that you can get out again. Technically, you can get in, you just can't get out. So the European Union is a big funder in Cyprus, both through its legal frameworks, the acquis communautaires, which kind of put out the structures of how civil society should operate within a European framework. And because that is not applied to the north of the island, they put like a lot of structural investment into infrastructure, into schools, water systems, and so on to the Turkish Cypriot side. The United Nations quite directly financed civil society and helped like building hundreds of different programs. So in the peak in the early 2000s, they had 120 different bicommunal NGOs that they were supporting. They realized that was really hard to control, but also hard to oversee their own fundings at some point anymore. So they kind of reduced that by the end of 2014 to around 9 NGOs that they were still supporting, bigger ones, who then had the role of like giving out funding on behalf of them, but they had to deal with less actors and a smaller number of actors. But that also came with like the professionalization of these NGOs. So if you wanted to have money, you needed organizational structures. You needed to be a registered NGO. It's not a legal requirement, but it was a tacit requirement. People needed to speak English because to fill in all these funding kind of applications and writing grants and so on, they need to be submitted in English. So there is an, kind of natural kind of selection process all of a sudden who can apply for these things. So you have to have the reporting capacity later. Sorry, 1 second. And they were also quite keen to work with trusted partners, so with people that have worked before. That also came with like an adaptation of the different sort of agendas that were represented. So bicommunalism was one of the big things. So if you run an NGO that wanted to be funded, you needed a Greek Cypriot and a Turkish Cypriot, so someone from both sides of the conflict to get money. You would have to support the bicommunal, bifederal state, which is the internationally proposed solution for the Cyprus conflict. And the other thing was regionalization. So one of the great ideas was, again, looking at global trends at the time, that bringing people together from different regions would really help. So we had a lot of people from Kosovo and from Bosnia Herzegovina, from kind of similar ethnic division conflicts that were flown into Cyprus, and Cypriots been flown there so they can learn and share just kind of experiences. So overall, everything that supports what we usually call the liberal peace framework became very important and part of the funding criteria that people kind of needed. And that is not quite unique to Cyprus. So, I mean, this is one of the hashtags that walked around in the internet. I think actually I got that from Jess at some point. That's what the donor wants. It was very popular also then in the Middle East, like when the Syrian conflict started, and people just talked about that to do what they want, they actually have to, on paper, do what the donor wants, and then kind of undermine that and kind of do their own projects again. So there was a lot of steering going on in terms of what projects are happening. So while the buffer zone was a space where people could retreat from both sides' governments and the government's kind of influence on them and the national regulations on them, they were all of a sudden subject to like a different kind of governance and regulation through the adaptation of agendas, through kind of receiving funding and so on. So this kind of idea of the neutral and ungoverned buffer zone and the kind of no man's land turned out to be actually quite incorrect, more or less. So one of the questions was then for me, what would actually happen if someone is not playing by these rules? And it was very interesting because at that point, a movement just decided not to do that. It was a very good coincidence for me. As part of the global Occupy movement, there was a Cypriot movement. It was called Global Occupy Buffer Zone Movement. And they had the same spirit as the Occupy movements around 2011, 12, 13 that were happening in other international capitals, basically. So they had a quite anti-capitalist, anti-kind of globalization stand, and so on. And they did something else which was very interesting. So I said in the beginning that people used a very tiny part of the buffer zone, one that was sort of allocated to them early on. It is also one that is a bit outside of the capital. I mean, Nicosia is small, you can still walk there within 10 minutes if you wanted to. But people wouldn't walk through by accident. People would go there on purpose. They would go because they wanted to be there. They wanted to be part of peace building. So these guys just sat at the main crossing within the capital. And there's one crossing that is mainly for tourists, but also for Greek and Turkish Cypriots from both sides who at this point wanted to start and cross. So they were very visible. And they were very in the way of politicians, in the way of international community, in the way of normal citizens. And they were not silent. They had a lot of banners, they had a lot of political messages, they were engaged with current politics. They would be very critical of the Turkish military at the point. They were very critical of internal Greek Cypriot kind of politics, and they put up a lot of banners that on both sides the government would have taken down if they could. So the interesting part was now that both sides' governments wanted these people gone, but they had no access to them because they're waiting in the safe zone. And the UN can't really do anything because they are the big supporters of peace, so they can't shut down civil society. But they got a lot of pressure from both governments at this point, so they really wanted them to be gone as well. The solution was actually quite legally tricky, but they just changed the boundaries of the buffer zone a bit and said that these people are actually not really in the buffer zone, they're on Greek Cypriot side, and now the Greek Cypriot police could go in after 3 months or so and just raided the camp and got rid of them. I think their legal ground in the end was 2 grams of marijuana or something that they found. So even these boundaries of the safe zone and of the buffer zone can all of a sudden be quite flexible if power wants them to be. So again, this idea of it's a neutral and governable space was undermined with that. So it's a safe zone for those who play by the rules. It was a safe zone for those selecting peace in the right way, and as you said early on, a small selected group which wasn't necessarily representative of all of society. And I think we can take more or less 3 conclusions from that. A few of them are quite empirical, a couple of them are kind of more on the theoretical side. So I would say on the empirical side, civil society, and this is exactly the point that you made, is very diverse, but how it's governed in these margins and how it's funded and supported meant it was restricted to a very small version of civil society or representation of civil society. Which means when you think back to this kind of little diagram I had in the beginning where I said civil society is a negotiator and a mediator between these different levels, they really weren't that anymore because they were only connected to a very small part of society, and society became, for that reason, very critical of them as well. So they lost this sort of popular and local legitimacy as well. So the donor kind of funding and support and approach towards them kind of fostered kind of a homogenization of the discourses. People say they kind of ended up in a third space, in kind of an echo chamber, in a kind of, it's we're always preaching to the converted. So it was a third space that was neither here nor there, but also not connected. It impacts, as I said, on the legitimacy. But also what we see is the buffer zone is as much as a controlled space by hegemonic power as both sides of the island. It's just a different power, but power has not retreated from the margins. And also they can have different interests, but there are still interests that are represented. And a bit more on like kind of the theoretical side of things from a peace building perspective, civil society might not fulfill its objectives as we have thought in the 1990s with this kind of really enthusiastic move towards civil society theory. And from a governance perspective, civil society opens new windows for intervention, so it gives also the international community a new tool, quote unquote, to engage with conflicts. So like one of the further questions I had from this study was like the idea of how does that then kind of, or what does that mean for international donors, and do they really regard civil society as a tool or not? And how is that kind of playing out in other conflicts and contexts? And well, that's so far on Cyprus. So if you have any questions about Cyprus, I'm happy to answering them now, and otherwise I transfer that to Ladak in a moment.
Okay, brilliant. So now we've got time for some questions on the Cyprus study. Thank you so much. That was excellent. I noticed a hand shoot right up, so please.
So, I mean, I didn't get enough time to do a lot of in-depth research on Cyprus, but from what I got, there are two major ethnicities, the Greek Cypriot and the Turkish Cypriot.
Yeah.
How big was the factor in the conflict? How big was decolonization a factor in the conflict? Because most post-colonial states are victims to poor federal structures because the colonizers just leave in a hurry. Like Ethiopia played a lot with a consociational federal structure, and it has given them good dividends. Could like Cyprus be following a similar structure in the future?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the big questions in Cyprus and the root cause of the conflicts is a new governance structure, right? So this power sharing agreements, how do you effectively share power between Greek and Turkish Cypriots? How do you get both of them being represented and like kind of keep their own identities? And that was obviously very much kind of connected to the problems of colonialization, both like the Ottoman Empire, but then also the kind of British colonialization of the island. No one left so much in a hurry in Cyprus. It was thought through a bit longer. It was a long process of negotiation. What was interesting is that the people who negotiated Cypriot independence were the UK, Greece, and Turkey, but not a single Cypriot was at the table. So again, it was about other people trying to figure out a great workable system. That didn't happen. And how far, I don't know enough about that case study to say in how far it would be like a model to follow that kind of path. But yeah, it is still the big question. So how is a political governance in contemporary Cyprus to be set up that is acceptable for both sides? Yeah. I don't have the answer to that.
That's good, because it needs more research in that area.
Yeah.
Okay.
Excellent. Any other questions?
This is not with respect to Cyprus issue per se, but also the larger issue. To what role do civil society actually play a positive role in addressing conflicts and disputes? How much are they dictated by the donors' agenda, and how far are the donors' agendas realistic? And I am talking this in terms of my limited knowledge of Sri Lankan regime. About 10 years ago, the war was still raging. We were talking for peace, without knowing what peace should deliver. And status quo itself became the full-time agenda.
Yeah.
Whereas when the war ended, or the armed movement ended, you had a perfect time to have a political solution. And that's when everyone was talking about human rights violation and accountability, which backfired for the state. In any art conference, there would be some excesses, and there is a balance between excesses as a give and take vis-a-vis having a political solution. Whereas people just looked at the legalities of human rights and excesses, forgetting the larger picture. And 10 years down the line, Sri Lanka's value was
So on the idea of kind of and how far civil society kind of has to follow these agendas, or yeah, I mean this
There
is
were two questions. One, how effective they are, and how much are they agenda driven by the group?
yeah. So I think like in modern Cyprus, like in the time when I did the kind of study, it was quite donor driven because it became livelihoods for people. So people needed jobs and they were working for the civil society sector. So part of that obviously then means that you're more inclined to follow certain agendas. On the other hand, they were also creative with it. Like, I mean, a lot of the NGOs take the money for one thing and hold the workshop that they should, but they also do other things. They kind of are really, there's so many people I met who are so driven to find a solution to something and who kind of argued with the donors how to do that. And others who took the easier way out of, like, you know, taking the money and then like, okay, yes, now we're doing a workshop on regionalization, even though everyone thought, let's never do regionalization again. We really don't want to hear what the Bosnians are saying anymore. It's like, after you're meeting the same people again and again, you feel like you're recreating your closed space at home somewhere else because just someone else said, like, you have the same conflict, and people say, no, we don't have the same conflict, but you have to do that kind of thing. So there was surely an issue with like following the agenda, but also people are like, or NGOs were creative with resisting and with subverting that kind of money. And the second part of your question, sorry, was
How helpful have they been?
yeah, I mean, so
Are they
yeah, I think they're. And possibly my talk was even a bit negative about this, but I think they've been incredibly helpful in opening this new space, in like creating some sort of intercommunal dialogue, something that wasn't thinkable out like 15 or 20 years ago. Now it's happening, so at least people are talking. Can they solve the Cyprus conflict? I don't think so. I mean, it's a geopolitical conflict. It's a conflict between like two ethnic groups. There's massive political investment in this. I once talked to one of the politicians who just said, yeah, we like that conflict. If we wouldn't have it, we would be like Malta. And like, who talks about Malta? So it's a big resource. It's a resource of getting international attention and money as well. And it's a fairly non-violent conflict. So there is a criticism to the negotiations happening in Cyprus. It's like a revolving door. Every time you almost have a solution, one of the two sides will let it fall through.
So your paper mentioned about Edward Adler as well, like you probably referred to him, and I really like the work that he does, and I see that there are two external homelands for the two ethnic communities over here, but then there's also a community that just sees themselves as Cypriots and nothing. They don't want to be involved in any of the ethnic groups. How do they go about in negotiating what is for the future of Cyprus?
Yeah. So one of the problems with the conflict, or that the conflict has brought, is the idea that Cyprus has two identities. You can be Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot. But there are a lot of other groups living in Cyprus. There's a big like Lebanese Mennonite community there that at some point had to decide which side they want to be part of. And then they became part of the Greek Cypriots, which is a very interesting story because they remember having a referendum and a kind of a vote in a village. And all of that has never, historically proven, has never taken place. It was just their leader having like a drink with the Greek Cypriot leader, and they gave him some kind of land and said like, no, come to ours. So I was like, okay, fine. But there's a collective memory of like, this was a community decision to do that. But yeah, it just shows that the way the conflict is framed, but also the kind of the way the solution to the conflict is framed is along ethnic lines. So it's really hard to get out of this. So the Occupy Buffer Zone movement, they had this idea of we're Cypriots. Like, we're not Greek Cypriots, we're not Turkish Cypriots, we're Cypriots. It's something that the people in the bicommunal movements quite often mention as well, like a Cypriot identity over a Greek or a Turkish identity. Obviously, it's Europe, so there's a lot of migrant groups as well who, like, you know, bring their own identity to that. And this is where you can see a lot of kind of parallels with Bosnia and Bosnia Herzegovina, where everything is now selected along ethnic lines and ethnic quotas. So people who don't fit into that can't run for civil service, for political office. So the European Court of Human Rights get one kind of appeal after the other, basically, from people saying, like, I'm not represented in that. And I see that Cyprus is heading into kind of a similar problem if the solution is a bi-communal, bi-federal state based on ethnic group and ethnic identity only. But how do you tell humanity, basically, get over your identities?
Okay, so I've got a question for all of you, building on some of this discussion. You're all, I think all of you guys around the table are going to a Borderland in December, correct? Which part of India is it? Northeast, and you'll be working with civil society, right? So how does what Birte has talked about in the Cyprus context compare to the context that you're going to? And I understand that you might not have had the chance to fully engage with and prepare for what you're going to do in December, but how do the two types of civil society compare? Donor engagements, how do they compare? Government presence in this area, how do they compare? What do you think?
Mm-hmm.
So it's probably not, I mean, we can't say whether the conflict's as good or bad, but at least there's no UN presence over there. So there's probably not a lot of international forces that are going to be there. It's going to be localized political elites that are playing for power.
So there's less of an international presence, so it's grassroots local civil society. How might that change the dynamics in the area? And feel free to jump in as well and offer thoughts.
I suppose I would, surely it's grassroots, so it would ensure that what the people actually want is represented through the civil society organization. But it could also make it harder for those organizations to get support in state institutions and get funding through other means. I think last time we had the ADGP of the BSF come in, and one thing that he pointed out is that a lot of the border NGOs don't really go to the BSF for any kind of support or funding, etc. So I think that's another factor that.
Just to clarify, the BSF is the Border Security Force, which handles the India-Bangladesh and India-Pakistan border as a designated border guarding force. So their former Additional Director General was here on Saturday to speak to them on the technicalities of border security. So just to supplement what you said.
I think it's a really good point that you're making here, because it was kind of what happened in Cyprus, that the lack of an international, or the internet, the small NGOs had a better voice because of the internationals, but that came basically as a prize later on with like steering that. But what does it mean for small NGOs in your area that there is no neutral external force to support them in first place?
And I just quickly, your first point is that a grassroots NGO might better represent the needs of the people, and I think that can be a research question you can take to that area. Does the NGO you're working with represent the needs of the whole community? Does it need to do its job well? These are kind of interrogations that you can take to the area, and have a bit of perspective as well as working with them in their aims. Yeah, there's a question.
So I don't know how the society in Cyprus compares to the society in India, or how similar they are. But I think in India, when it comes to grassroots implementation, since it's a country which is driven by politics so much and political elites, I would like to have your view on this as well. I mean, and since there is no international presence in India, the international donor presence like the United Nations, how will the civil society's role in mediating a conflict be affected by the political interests of the political parties present in India? So that is one question that I would like to. Since there is no mediation by an international body, the politics in the particular local region would have a major role to play to either positively or negatively influence the role of the civil society.
If I may just ask a contrary question to what he asked. Absence of civil society, don't you think it has been a benefit? And having political leaders resolving problems, whether it be Mizoram, Lal Tega signed a deal with Rajiv Gandhi and none of us hear anything from Mizoram. That is, if we take Nagaland, for 20 years now you've got a ceasefire agreement because of the political. Whereas again in Nagaland, it was the Nagas Mothers Association and the church playing its own role. But in Mizoram, there's no other civil society. There's just the two primary leaders, the Indian state and the Mizo National Front, represented by Lal Tega. Problem solved. In all of the places, if we take in Assam, the greatest students' movement was ASU, All Assam Students Union, which gave rise to AGP, which was a political party. Now, we got so many civil society or students' movement that you don't know where to begin. Everything now goes down to sub-stratification of society. What is the issue? All of us have forgotten the primary dispute.
Do you want to, after you finish drinking on your tea, do you want to make a response to this discussion?
Sorry, I got a terrible cold in Ladakh last week, and I'm still not over that. I think it goes back to the other point, basically, of like, what do you do if there is no other force or counterweight or counterpower who helps, like, hear marginalized voices being heard? And you can almost only say the same as Jess said, like, take that as a research question to your field and see it, because there was no space for that kind of civil society engagement with the conflict as long as the buffer zone was close to them, because national elites on both sides shut down this discourse entirely. So the question is, where would people find spaces that are, like, you know, every power can never control all the spaces. There will always be kind of pockets of resistance. There will be places that can't be reached by hegemonic power and so on. So where are these places in your borderlands, and how can people use them, basically? I can't give you the answer to that, basically, but I think you would find places where people find that they can make politics even if it's against the kind of what's portrayed as national interest.
Great, and I would also just add to that in terms of the initial framing of your question. There's no international actors in India. It's local, and therefore politics is involved. Well, there's heavy politics in international as well. It's just might be a different sort of dynamic. So interrogating the politics at all levels is interesting as well as necessary. Are there any more questions related to Cyprus, civil society, and the borderlands? Yeah, please go ahead.
Is there any effort from the institutional side of things, like from the UN or any of the funding organizations, to maybe change the criteria or make it broader to allow for more engagement?
I'm trying to answer that as long as I can speak. I think that they go in a circle side of, they started with funding for this very small group, then went all in for over 120 organizations, reduced it, then gave money to other NGOs saying, you try and figure out what kind of is needed. So they kind of worked with their trusted partners, but made them design projects or support small projects across the island. So I think there's a genuine attempt to try to reach as many different diverse people as possible. But I think they haven't found a good system yet of how to implement that.
And this is something that I've worked on a little bit as well. And there's a broader agenda underpinning why international organizations and donors require organizations to look a certain way, report a certain way, and therefore only encourage a certain type of partner. And this is both in the development, the humanitarian, and the peace and conflict sector. There's a lot of overlap. And it came as a result of international organizations and dominant governments in the 1970s, 1980s, neoliberal agenda, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, etc., pioneering new public management where everything has to have results and results need to be measurable. You know, so peace, I mean, how do you account for peace in numerical metrics? How do you account, this is why humanitarian organizations always look at number of lives saved rather than more complex aspects of the quality of life and so on. And this agenda still dominates, still continues to dominate across those different sectors, and that's why even though you talk to individuals within the UN, within the EU, within NGOs, everyone understands that that's probably not the best way to make change, but the systems are in place and informed by this dominant ideology. So it's not going to change for a while yet.
This is why events are such a popular tool, because you can count people attending. It's very easy. Like, you know, it's like, and you're reporting metrics to your donor. We ran this event, 100 people came. And you see it in academia as well. I mean, we get grants for our research projects that literally want the amount
of articles you publish, the number of conferences you organize, and it's all numerically measured. So it's a very dominant agenda. Any final comments on Cyprus? No? Then perhaps we... Do you have one, Samrat?
No, I'll once this afternoon, I'll come back to the end.
You sure?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, so the next part...
If I may just ask one thing.
Of course you
How
may.
much of the Cyprus conflict is more to the location of the island and the geostrategy of it, the geopolitics of it? Because the British Empire and Pax Britannica was built by Britain controlling critical seas of the Middle East. Straits of Gibraltar is still British territory. Suez Canal till Nasser nationalized it was British control. So is this suffering from that?
Yeah. So if you look at the history of Cyprus and the history of colonialization by just everyone in the region you can think of, the origins of the Cyprus conflict very much originate from its geopolitical kind of position, and even the process of decolonialization was driven by kind of geopolitical interests. Today, I don't think Cyprus is very important anymore for geopolitics necessarily, as long as you can find a solution that keeps Greece and Turkey happy at the same time, because you don't want frictions in the NATO, basically. That is the only, but the position of Cyprus itself, I think, has kind of lessened as so important.
Can I add
Yeah.
something to answer?
Yeah.
So Cyprus is a part of a bigger game between the European Union and Turkey. I wouldn't go as far as the colonial empire. It's like a EU-Turkey bargain. So before they access to the European Union, the requirement was on behalf of Brussels to unify the whole island and enter as a Republic of Cyprus. The and all the efforts failed. Unfortunately, when they entered, the island remained partitioned, and the European Union law was suspended on the northern part. Before the accession, 2004, the Turks were not really interested in. I mean, the Turkish part of Cyprus were not really interested in making a reconciliation, because they had Turkey behind them with so-called unlimited resources. After the accession, it turned out that tourism, shipping, and the connecting services produced a huge income for the Greek part. So now the Greeks are not really interested to make a reconciliation with the Turks. But as a bigger game, until the EU and the Turkish republics cannot make a normal, how should I explain it, relationship, which won't come in the near future. So the Cyprus problem will be a problem like this. So this is the answer.
Thanks.
Thanks very much for your input, Aliko. And you just don't want to, you'll wait till the end to add your comment? Okay.